Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. This afternoon I'm going to address the concept of tanha, its place in the Noble Truths, dependent origination, the three kinds of tanha, and so forth. Tanha is very much a central topic, central concept in the Buddhist construction. It appears first in the second Noble Truth, which is the truth of the origin of suffering, is said to be tanha. So what is tanha? The standard translation has been desire, which is for most purposes good enough. It is a little bit confusing, which I'll get to that point. The literal meaning of the word is thirst. It's from the Sanskrit trishna. The implication of thirst is a being feels in the need of some relief or some desired object, like a thirsty person desires a glass of water. The reason desire is not quite perfect is because it leads to an objection you sometimes hear, or a criticism. They say, if you get rid of all desire, then you'll just be like like you're in a coma. You won't have any impulse to do anything. Where does even the desire to practice meditation or to gain liberation come from? That's a desire, and it is. And that's because there's another word in Pali that is broader than tanha, and that's chanda. Tanha is a very specific kind of desire. Chanda is more general. And sometimes that chanda has been translated as enthusiasm or zeal or zest. These are all too specific. Chanda is the impulse to do or acquire something, and it can be a positive factor depending on the object. So there's a kind of chanda that's called Dhammachanda, which is a desire or the impulse for Dhamma. Kamachanda is the desire for sense objects, and that is pretty much the same as Kamhatanha, the desire for sense objects. So chanda is more general, and chanda can be a positive thing if it's a desire or enthusiasm or an impulse to do something wholesome, positive, either leading towards one's own awakening or towards compassionate action. Then chanda is a positive quality. In fact, chanda is one of the four roads to power, the Iddhipada. So it comes in the list, which is included in the broader list of the 37 Bodhipakadhammas. So it's considered to be one of the factors leading towards awakening. So overcoming tanha does not mean becoming like a inert lump. One still has an impulse for action. Tanha is very specific, and this also is found right away in the formula for the Four Noble Truths, as found in the Buddha's first discourse, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. The formula for the second Noble Truth defines tanha as being of three kinds. There is the desire for sense objects, kama tanha, the desire for becoming, bhava tanha, and the desire for not being, vibhava tanha. So tanha has this very specific set of objects. Tanha comes up also in the dependent origination. It follows from sense contact leads to feeling, leads to tanha. Mostly and particularly talking about kamha tanha, desire for sense objects. When we contact an object with the senses, it arouses feeling of being pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And that arouses tanha, thirst, which takes the form of either the desire for pleasant objects or the desire to be rid of unpleasant objects. And that leads to upadana, clinging, and that leads to bhava, becoming, or being, manifesting. And this link between feeling and tanha is very important. It's the transition from resultant to karmically active. What that means is that up to the point of feeling, we're dealing with automatic processes determined by past karma and other factors. So there's nothing that can be done about it. It just unfolds according to natural law. But at the moment after feeling, there's a space for volition or for choice to come in. And if we don't make an effort, then we naturally follow the path of least resistance into craving. But this is said to be the weak link in the dependent origination, that at this point you can break the cycle by not allowing feeling to become craving. Once it becomes craving, it becomes harder to deal with. Once it becomes clinging, it obsesses the mind, and then it leads to becoming, birth, sickness, old age, and death. So tanha, as we see, has the central role both in the Four Noble Truths and in the dependent origination. So it's a very important factor, and it's crucial to understand what it implies, what it means. As I said, there are these three kinds of tanha: kamha tanha, bhava tanha, vibhava tanha. The desire for sense objects, the desire for becoming, and the desire for not becoming. And it's kind of interesting or somewhat significant that this has parallels in other systems as well. One thing that I've noticed long ago is that the three kinds of tanha appear in the three temptations of the devil gave to Christ in the desert, in the Christian gospel. When Jesus went off for a 40-day retreat in the desert, a fasting retreat, the devil tempted him three times. The first time was with bread. He said, you could use your divine power to change these stones into bread, and you could break your fast and eat and be satisfied. So that's sense desire for food. Then he tempted Christ with, he said, if you bow down to me, I shall make you king of the world. You shall rule over all the nations. So that's the desire for being or becoming. And then the last temptation was, why don't you just throw yourself off the cliff? Desire for not being. So let's look at these three forms of tanha one by one. Kamha tanha, the desire for sense objects, is the most obvious in this form of existence. As a human being, where that is being human is a subset of the larger class of beings known as sense desire beings, which includes animals and devas. That beings in this level of existence are dominated, their psyche is dominated by their senses. And their impulses, their thoughts, their emotions, their desires, their fears and hopes, everything revolves around sense objects. Acquiring pleasant sense objects and escaping unpleasant sense objects. And this is a very fundamental psychological basis for this whole level of existence. So it's quite normal, it's kind of default mode for human beings to be caught up in sense desire, which means at the simplest, it means the seeking to possess and hold pleasant sights, sounds, tastes, touches, and also mental objects, and to avoid their unpleasant correlates. So understanding this, seeing this impulse in oneself and understanding it is really one of the first steps, and seeing how this leads inevitably to suffering. Now, there's one thing I want to clarify. This teaching around sense desire is often poorly understood or grasped by people. Either they reject it out of hand, seeing it as negative, as life denying, puritanical, so they reject it out of hand, or they go to the other extreme and they become kind of fanatic about it. So it's important to understand exactly what we're talking about here. Sense pleasures, enjoyment or acquisition of sense pleasures, is not really an ethical issue. It's not an ethical failing or breach to enjoy a sense pleasure. The problem is somewhere else. It's not a problem of ethics, provided, of course, that the acquisition of the object has been done in a lawful way that would not involve stealing or harming others. The problem is one of keeping consciousness bound to this lower limit. It's a question of sense desire and sense enjoyment bind one to samsaric becoming. It's the primary engine of samsara. At the most fundamental level, the kind of the most atomic level of the psyche, there's the momentary impulse of consciousness to take an object. And that's really at the most rudimentary level. There's consciousness seeks an object, so there's desire happening there for a sense object, which can include a mind sense object. And this is what drives samsara. This is what brings samsara into being, is this constant quest of consciousness to take an object. And the objects, of course, are unsatisfying. I mean, this is a whole other discussion, but we find the objects are dukkha, they're unsatisfying, and the mind then is left wanting and incomplete, and then seeks the next object, the next shiny, wonderful thing, which then turns out to be tarnished, tawdry goods as well. And this is the first and second noble truth at the level of mind moments, at an abhidhammic level. But more broadly speaking, is the impulse to experience and enjoy sense pleasures keeps one within that sense desire level of existence, which is the coarsest, most confusing and bewildering level of samsaric mind states. It's like the outer limit of existence. We're caught in this maelstrom of objects that are alternately fascinating and terrifying. We're whirled around. And the impulse that drives that is desire. It's tanha. That's why for development of meditation, the quality of indriya samvara is very important. That is, restraint of the senses. Not going out through the senses, but going inward. And that is why on a retreat or as a periodic exercise, lay people take the 8 precepts rather than the 5, because the additional precepts are not ethical ones at all. I mean, there's nothing sinful or evil about having a cookie in the afternoon. The additional precepts in the 8 are sense restraint precepts. They're an aid and an assist to sense restraint by giving you an external limit, cutting off avenues of sense exploration, of going out through the senses, so that the mind is more constrained to staying inward. So they're a great aid to developing indriya samvara, sense restraint, which itself is a very great aid to developing samadhi. The factor of sense desire, kamha tanha, is not overcome completely until the stage of anagami. That's the third stage of awakening. At the second stage, sakadagami, the factor is attenuated, weakened, or loosened, but it still has a presence. So this shows how deeply rooted and fundamental to our psychology as sense desire beings this factor is. It's really the factor that keeps us at this level of existence. But as fundamental as it is, and as prevalent as it is in our psyches, it's not the deepest one. It's relatively superficial compared to the other 2 forms of tanha. Because it's on this kind of surface level, it's the noisiest. It demands the most attention from us usually. It's the biggest problem. It's the most obvious. But underlying it are the other 2 forms of tanha, bhava tanha, vibhava tanha, which are kind of 2 sides of the same coin. They're opposites, but they're polar or complementary opposites. The factor of bhava tanha is the desire to be or to become. At its most rudimentary level, it's just the desire to exist, the impulse to be, to exist. But it manifests often in the psyche as a desire to be something greater than we are. To be stronger, smarter, more beautiful, more famous, more popular, richer, to be more, To get your picture on the cover of the Rolling Stone. It's the bhava tanha. This is ambition, the desire to expand, to be a bigger person. And that has the flip side of vibhava tanha, which is a desire not to be. And in its most extreme form, it's self-destructive or suicidal impulses, the desire for annihilation. But on a lesser form that is very commonly experienced by just about everybody from time to time is just a desire to be less conscious, to desire to dull consciousness down, because consciousness is perceived at times as a burden. So we want to be less conscious, and there's this desire, and it's manifests in things like oversleeping or taking drugs or alcohol, or even something like vegging out in front of the TV. These are ways of throttling down consciousness. There's a line from the memoirs of Samuel Johnson. Somebody asked him, a woman asked him, why is it that men make themselves into beasts with drink? And he said, it's so that they can escape for a time the pain of being a man. The pain of being a human being is sometimes feels like too much. So this is vibhava tanha. So this is like the life impulse on the death wish, right? There's two sides of the kind of the same thing. And these impulses are underlying our psyche, and they're actually more fundamental, and they underlie sense desire. Sense desire is relatively superficial, although it, as I say, it's the noisiest, it demands the most attention most of the time. These other ones are deeper. And this is shown by a couple of examples. One is that these impulse, or at least bhava tanha, is still present even in the anagami. So an anagami is third stage of awakening, is someone who's almost fully liberated. It's only the arahant who's overcome bhava tanha altogether. And that's why an anagami, as the name means non-returner, that's why when they pass on from their human existence, they are reborn only in the Suddhavasa, the pure abodes, which is beyond the sense desire realm, because they have no karmic impulse left. They've overcome sense desire, so they have no possible way of taking form in the sense desire realm. But they still have the desire for fine material becoming and immaterial becoming. That is to take birth in the Rupa Loka or the Arupa Loka. And their particular spot in those realms in which they are reborn is the pure abodes, which is a realm beyond sensuality, but it's not beyond becoming. The Rupa Loka broadly is the realm of the Brahma beings. They're beings who have passed beyond sensuality. So they've transcended sensuality, so they don't have kamha tanha. But we see from stories about the Brahma beings that sometimes they're very much subject to bhava tanha in the forms of pride and arrogance and self-aggrandizement. We have the story of Baka the Brahma, who came to believe that he was the supreme being of the universe until the Buddha came and put him straight. But he wasn't subject to sensuality, but he was full of bhava tanha. So we can be on guard and observe and see these three forms of tanha arising in ourselves, and see how they operate to keep us bound to samsara. Sense desire keeps us bound to the outermost level of samsara, the sense desire realm. But even if we can temporarily separate ourselves from that, as for example in the state of jhana, sense desire is not present, that jhana is the equivalent to having Brahma level consciousness. So it's a consciousness that's transcended sense desire, but there's still bhava-tanha, there's still a desire to be. It can also take the form of, although this is much less common nowadays, but there is a form of meditative absorption that the Buddha denounced that is based on vibhava-tanha. There were those yogis in his time who came to the conclusion that the source of all suffering is consciousness and perception. And they practiced a kind of self-annihilating meditation. It's basically like a form of anesthetic to the mind. And when they die, they're reborn into the asanya loka, the realm of the unconscious beings, which is this weird corner of the cosmos where beings are born that sit like statues for aeons of time without a single thought or perception. And when one occurs, they can't exist in that realm anymore. They immediately die from that realm and are reborn elsewhere. I think a very close analogy to that kind of hiatus in consciousness is general anesthetic. If anyone has ever been, had a medical procedure where they were put under general anesthetic, I experienced that once, and I found it was quite remarkable. The anesthesist puts this cone on your face with the gas, and he says, count to 10, from 10 down to 1 backwards, and you go 10, 9, 8, 7, and then you open your eyes, and it's like 2 hours later you're in the recovery room. And there's absolutely no sense of time having passed, which is very different from the deepest sleep. When you wake up after a night's sleep, no matter how exhausted you were and how deeply you've slept, there's a sense of time having passed, even though you don't remember details. You sense time has passed, but not in anesthetic. It's not. And it's said about this realm of unconscious beings that hundreds of kappas, or world ages, can pass by, but for them that time doesn't count in their mind stream. The moment before they enter that realm is followed immediately by the moment when they leave that realm. So that's an extreme result of vibhava tanha. Vibhava tanha generally leads to no good. You're setting up karmic conditions for a lower rebirth of some kind if you indulge in vibhava tanha. Bhava tanha sets the conditions for rebirth, but vibhava tanha for a more or a less fortunate form of birth generally. So we can see from these examples and from the dependent origination that tanha in all its forms is the root of becoming. It's the ultimate cause of manifestation, together with ignorance. If we weren't ignorant, we wouldn't fall into tanha. So the whole of samsaric existence, of falling into conditionality, is energized or kept in place by this process of tanha. Like we're spinning a fabric of existence, constantly, moment by moment. When tanha is ceased, annihilated completely, then there's no more energy for manifestation and for conditionality, and one discovers the unconditioned, transcending all forms of being and not being. So that's a few words on the concept of tanha.
Anamayam Dhammachanda Sadhu Param Dharamase.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.